Above the coal, a hearth smouldered, surrounded by grey stones that Raven himself, with diligence and skill, had pulled from the bed of a mountain stream.
The flames, which had been fierce and high just a moment ago, had now quieted down, turning into an even, almost meditative breath, spewing orange smoke that smelled of tree resin into the heavy, humid air of the taiga.
Voron sat motionless, his silhouette indistinguishable from the shadows of the centuries-old cedars surrounding his small hut. His eyes seemingly seeing not what was in front of him, but what was to come. He did not sleep, never slept on nights like this, when the full brazen moon broke through the treetops, flooding the clearing with a deathly pale, unnatural light. This glow disrupted the natural balance, making tracks too obvious and too easy to erase. He believed in a rule established by millions of years of evolution. If the light you see carries danger, then peace is a luxury.
It was into this unnatural silence, into this moment of wrong light, that a sound intruded. A sound completely alien to this world. A dull, steady, stubborn hum of an engine that belonged neither to the forester's all-terrain vehicle nor to the poacher's old truck. It was something urban, soft but fast, moving along the old, overgrown clearing. A sound that Raven perceived as dirt brought onto clean, untouched snow. He rose from his equally silent chair without making a single unnecessary movement that could disrupt his inner rhythm. Shadow, a huge, almost black dog that always lay at his feet, raised his massive head and listened. He did not growl. Shadow knew that his master had heard the sound long before he had, and that he had already made his decision. His master controlled everything that happened within a 5-kilometer radius of his home. The visitor appeared in the clearing half an hour later, having walked the last 1.5 kilometers on foot. He was dressed in an expensive jacket and trousers, now wet from dew and prickly branches, clearly unsuitable for a taiga crossing. His breathing was ragged, and his face, illuminated by the faint light of the fire, looked haggard and almost frightened. It was Sergei, a former colleague whose face Voron had not seen for 5 years. Their paths had diverged sharply and irreversibly at the very fault line that had occurred in the law enforcement system. A major corruption scandal in which Voron saw not just a crime, but a perversion of the very idea of justice. He laughed, contemptuously rejecting his insignia and rank. Sergei, unlike Ivan, stayed, deciding that it was better to fix what was rotten from the inside than to run away. Since then, they had exchanged only formal, strained work messages. But his arrival here, in this hideout, was a sign of absolute critical trouble. Sergei did not waste words on greetings or empty explanations. He muttered that he had come because there was no one else left. And then he named a name. Victor. Victor, an old friend of Voron's, almost a brother, whom they had known together since their cadet days, and who, like Ivan, had once decided that he'd had enough. But Victor, unlike Voron, did not go into the forest. He settled on the outskirts of the city, in that very indistinct semi-industrial area where the city is no longer a city, but not yet nature. He disappeared, Ivan, Sergei said, his voice dry, devoid of its usual self-confidence. He just disappeared. His family has been waiting hysterically for 2 days now. The police... You know how the city machine works. There's no soil there, no traces, only concrete and asphalt. We're powerless. Voron stared at the fire, letting the words settle like ashes on his consciousness. City. The word echoed in his soul, with a disgusting, metallic echo. The smell of machine oil, and rotting garbage. For him, the city was a lie, a huge, deceitful organism that hid its true diseases, its true traces under a layer of concrete and neon signs.
He had run here to breathe the truth, to let his skills of trace reading work in a natural environment, rather than among a jumble of foreign, meaningless imprints. He left to live by the code of the forest, where every action leaves an honest trace, and where predator and prey observe an unspoken, ancient rule of balance.
And now, he was being asked to return to this concrete trap, where the truth is always what is hidden. But Victor was the only person who once, on that very fault line, when Raven was being squeezed out of the system, did not waver and did not betray him.
He did not openly go against the system, but he also did not sign the false report that ruined Ivan's career. An unspoken, unbreakable bond remained between them. A bond that had nothing to do with the law or rank, but was based entirely on the concept of honor and justice, which Voron considered to be the only true values in this world. It was his personal challenge. He couldn't abandon a friend who had made his choice and now had become a victim of the very forces they had both fled from. "I'll go," Raven finally said, his voice dull and calm. "But you stay. The city has already consumed you. I need a clear view, unclouded by your rules of the game." Sergei did not argue. He just nodded, his fatigue more eloquent than any words. He knew that Raven, with his uncompromising code and unique intuition, was their only hope. Voron began to pack. He packed his backpack with only the bare essentials: tools, a minimal supply of food, and a map. He was taking Shadow with him. She would be useless for scent in the city, but her presence was his anchor, a reminder that there was a world where order was absolute and chaos had no power. He knew that this duty would lead him into the very corridors of power and corruption from which he had fled. He wasn't just returning, he was going hunting in a strange, hostile environment, to find not just a friend, but proof of the very injustice that had crippled his own life. He took out an old leather-bound notebook from a safe hidden under the floor, in which he kept records of all his unfinished business. The ones he was not allowed to finish. The person behind his departure was his personal ghost, his personal enemy. Follow the trail in the concrete. Find the truth among the rubble. The thought pierced him like a cold wind. He wasn't looking for revenge, but he was looking to restore order, to restore the balance that had been disrupted. It was a hunt for his own past, which had suddenly burst out of the shadows and demanded immediate reckoning. Behind him lay his world, a world of clean traces, and ahead of him lay asphalt, sticky, dirty, hiding millions of footprints, none of which would be honest. Voron zipped up his backpack, put on his old worn jacket and, nodding to Sergei, who remained sitting by the fire as if unable to move, stepped into the darkness that he now had to carry within himself. The city was waiting, and Voron, despising it, walked on, old, angular, inconspicuous, like a mossy stone on a mountain trail. The SUV that Raven had once named Netapir, for its ability to move silently in the dark, spit them out of the clean, pine-scented world into the foul, rumbling belly of the city. The contrast was not just physical, it was metaphysical. The walls of the TAIGA, which at first seemed impenetrable and hostile, now appeared to be the last bastion of order, while the city, in all its neon, concrete fullness, turned out to be a real, tangible anomaly. There were no clear rules here. Every sound, every smell, every line on the asphalt was a lie concealing the real state of affairs. The air, thick and oily, pressed on the chest, forcing one to breathe with effort. The shadow lying in the back seat breathed heavily and unnaturally, its powerful body tense. It instinctively felt itself in a strange, hostile environment, where thousands of unfamiliar smells mixed into something meaningless and threatening, canceling out its natural donde quiera te vaya. They arrived at the outskirts. This part of the city had neither the proud imperial stucco nor the glass arrogance of the business center. It was a zone of alienation, a place where the private sector, barely restrained by a dilapidated wooden fence, abutted abandoned hangars and long-defunct workshops. Here people lived in constant struggle with dust, noise, and the shadows cast by giant rusty pipes. Victor's house was the embodiment of this peripheral philosophy. A grey brick mansion, absurdly pressed on one side against the broken, diesel-smelling wasteland, and on the other, against a row of typical two-story houses whose walls held a century of weariness. Voron stopped the netopera a little further away, under a spreading but stunted poplar tree, which seemed to be the only thing in the area trying to breathe deeply. He got out of the car, allowing Taneve to finally jump out after him. The dog moved immediately, not to stretch his legs, but to take up a defensive position, his gaze hard and focused, scanning every corner, every pile of rubbish. They were met at the door by Victor's wife, Svetlana. She looked like a bird that had been plucked of all its feathers in one fell swoop. Her face was gaunt and haggard, her eyes red from sleeplessness and tears, and her movements nervous and senseless. The presence of Sergei, who had arrived in a second car, did not calm her, but the appearance of Voron, this silent man who smelled of forest and cold water, suddenly silenced her. She saw in him not a policeman, not an investigator, but something more ancient and reliable. A hunter who had come for his prey. Voron did not waste time on unnecessary consolations. He immediately asked to be taken to the room where Victor had last been seen. It was a small, cluttered study where Victor probably spent his evenings, hiding from the hustle and bustle of the city. The first thing Raven noticed was not the mess, but, on the contrary, the lack of mess. If Victor had simply left, there would have been some logic to his departure. An abandoned phone, an unfinished book, an unlocked door. Here, everything was neat, too neat. It seemed as if the man had stepped out for a moment and disappeared. He left on his own, but not of his own free will, Raven said quietly, his eyes slowly scanning the walls, furniture, and floor. He despised standard police protocols that required photographing and collecting fingerprints. For him, it was just superficial scraping. He wasn't looking for evidence, but for a trace, a violation of order, an imprint of someone else's hostile will. Voron leaned over the old wooden desk. Victor, like Voron, was a man of the old school, who preferred paper and pen to digital gadgets. On the table lay a neat stack of newspapers and a scrap of draft paper. Raven carefully examined the ink stain. It was dry. This meant that Victor had finished writing, put down his pen, and only then was he taken away. They took him so quietly that he did not have time to finish the sentence or even crumple the paper. Leaving Svetlana in the doorway, the shadow moved along the baseboard, sniffing at the unfamiliar smell. She made several circles, and suddenly, her movements became hesitant. She stopped at the window leading to a small, overgrown courtyard and whimpered softly. It was not a call to play or a sign of danger. It was a confused animal that could not recognize a clean trail. "The smell of the city," Raven whispered. "It drowns everything out." He moved to the window. The curtain was slightly open, but the glass was clean. He touched the thin layer of dust on the windowsill with his fingertips. Ordinary city dust, carrying particles of tires, exhaust, construction debris. But among this gray coating, his eye, trained on millions of wild animal tracks on wet moss and dry earth, caught something that any forensic scientist would have missed. A tiny, barely noticeable mark, as if something soft and delicate, something precious, had been pressed against the glass for a moment. It was not a fingerprint. It was a mark that could have been left by a piece of expensive, thin fabric or leather. He went out into the yard. The courtyard was covered in mud and littered with old junk. Broken bicycles, rusty barrels, empty boxes. Here, on this unfamiliar territory, Raven finally felt in his element. The yard, littered with rubbish, was the equivalent of a TAIGA windfall. It was a place where ordinary people did not look or search. The ground beneath his feet was damp, mixed with gravel and construction debris. He knelt down, not afraid to get his old jacket dirty. Raven began to read this urban trail. First, there were Victor's footprints leading to the gate. Ordinary, everyday footprints. But next to them, almost invisible in the mud, were others, more distinct. Expensive shoes with thin leather soles that don't slip, but aren't designed for walking in mud. 2 sets of tracks. 2 strangers. And they were carrying weight. He saw that Victor's tracks were not as deep as those of the kidnappers. This meant that Victor had most likely been forced to leave, but he had not actively resisted, or had already been immobilized. And then he found the first, indisputable piece of evidence that the police, in their rush, would undoubtedly have discarded as trash. At the very base of an old, half-dead honeysuckle bush, he discovered a cut on a branch, as thin as a spider's web, but deep. It was not the work of a cat or a random gust of wind. It was the mark of a knife or something sharp, held by a person passing very close to the bush. The cut was clean, almost surgical. It spoke of professionalism and nervousness. Nearby, almost buried in wet sand, lay a cigarette butt. Raven picked it up and narrowed his eyes. It wasn't a Prima, which Victor smoked, nor was it a cheap cigarette that a random passerby would have left behind. It was a filter from an expensive, imported cigarette that had a specific, subtle aroma. The Raven brought it to his nose. The smell of tobacco was mixed with something sharp, the aroma of expensive but overly strong men's cologne. "A city mark," he muttered. He stood up, clutching the cigarette butt in his palm. His contempt for the city gave way to cold, calculated determination. Here, on the concrete and in the dirt, the same laws of tracking applied as in the TAIGA. Only they had to be read with an adjustment for human baseness and cynicism. Victor didn't just disappear. People came for him. People who were prepared, who had influence and money, and who knew what they were doing. It wasn't a spontaneous act. It was a clean job, planned like a trap for a large animal. Voron turned to Sergei. He was standing there, shifting nervously from foot to foot, his eyes, accustomed to office light and paperwork, seeing nothing but dirt. "We have a start," said Raven, his voice sounding like the creaking of metal.
2 people, an expensive car, and they were nervous, smoking, waiting a long time. "We'll search through this trash. We need to find tire tracks leading away from here.
And not just any car's tracks, but ones that matched their status." He returned to the car. For the first time in a long time, his soul felt the familiar, chilling rush of adrenaline. He wasn't just looking for a friend. He was back on the path he had left many years ago. And this time, he couldn't leave it until he restored his disturbed balance. The urban hunt had begun. The Raven slowly circled the perimeter of the building, like an experienced predator, studying the perimeter of hunting grounds that were foreign, but subject to his mind. He separated from Svetlana and Sergei, who, stuck in a trap of bureaucratic and family despair, continued to exchange nervous, meaningless words at the very door of Victor's house. For them, this courtyard was just a dirty backyard filled with junk and regrets. For Voron, however, it was an urban taiga, the most difficult landscape to read, where natural traces were drowned out by millions of artificial layers. His task was to separate noise from signal, lies from truth. His gaze, which, in the forest, could distinguish a broken branch from 2 years ago, or a barely noticeable claw mark on a tree, now scanned intently over concrete slabs mixed with gravel, damp earth, and piles of rotting household waste. Rubbish, as he had always believed, was the most honest chronicle of human life. But in the city, this chronicle was written hastily, carelessly, and falsely. In the forest, every trace strives to preserve itself, but here, everything seems aimed at disappearing, dissolving into indifferent noise. The Raven stopped at an old, overturned wheel, half buried in clay. It had probably been lying there for months. But next to it, on the ground that was not yet completely soggy, he saw a thin, almost transparent film of oil that could only have come from a heavy vehicle that had just passed by. He knelt down and ran his finger over the oil stain which, under the influence of moisture, was beginning to blur and lose its shape. The oil was still fresh. It was not an old leaked trail. It was something left in a hurry. He moved to the edge of the gravel path that led from the gate to the street. Here, on the denser but still damp surface, his attention was drawn to the tire tracks. These were not the usual worn tracks of his neighbor's cars. These were wide, aggressive grooves characteristic of a powerful, expensive SUV or minivan. He carefully examined the depth of the imprint, barely breathing so as not to disturb the delicate edges. The depth suggested considerable weight, possibly extra cargo, or, more likely, a full load of people. He imagined the vehicle, massive, black, silent. It was not a car for everyday driving. It was a tool brought here for a specific purpose. His gaze returned to the cigarette butt, found near the honeysuckle bush. He turned it over, sniffed it again, memorizing the complex, repulsive smell of expensive tobacco, mixed with excessive perfume. The smell of the city, designed to mask rather than reveal. But the Raven knew that even a mask, if worn too long and carelessly, leaves its mark. He took the cigarette butt with him, carefully wrapping it in a piece of clean paper napkin. This cigarette butt was a calling card, the only signature in this dirty, anonymous space. Moving toward the gate, he again stumbled upon the traces of expensive shoes that he had already noticed the first time. Now he could examine them in more detail. They were not just clear. They pointed to a person who moved with confidence, but not caution. Unlike Victor's footprints, which were even and calm, These footprints had a slightly deeper pressure on the toe, which is characteristic of a person carrying extra weight or experiencing psychological stress.
Voron's attention was drawn to a low rotten fence separating Victor's yard from the neighbor's, where the same hopeless decay reigned.
In the corner where most of the rubbish had accumulated, broken bottles, pieces of brick, old rags, he saw something that the police had probably mistaken for part of the general mess. It was a piece of pale yellow, almost white, synthetic film.
Raven took a pair of fine tweezers out of his backpack, a tool that served to remove splinters or analyze wool in the forest, but here became the key to urban secrets. He carefully picked up the piece of film.
It had black, neat letterpress printing on it.
Raven knew this kind of packaging. It was part of the inner liner from a pack of premium cigarettes, the very ones that matched his cigarette butt. It was not just a coincidence. It was a double clue. Two men were smoking. One of them carelessly threw away a cigarette butt, and the second, or the same one, more nervous, tore open the package and threw away the unnecessary insert without thinking that even this trifle could become a clue. This confirmed that the men had not just arrived, they had been waiting, planning, and feeling nervous. An expensive car, expensive shoes, expensive cigarettes. All this spoke of the high rank of the perpetrators, but their nervousness indicated that the task was unfamiliar or too important for them. This was not just petty theft or hooliganism.
Voron raised his head. He looked at the roof, covered with old, rusty iron in places. Nothing. Then his gaze returned to the gate. The gate was old and creaky, and hadn't been oiled in a long time. If Victor had resisted, there would have been signs of a struggle here. A broken board, scraped paint. But the gate was in perfect condition for its age. No signs of forced entry or resistance. He returned to Sergei, who seemed ready to call all the authorities at once. Voron handed him a napkin with a cigarette butt and a piece of plastic wrap. "Here's your evidence," he said. "The police were looking for signs of a break-in. I'm looking for signs of order that is being disturbed. They didn't break in. They lured him out. Or he knew them. But it was coercion. A thin trace on a branch of a bush. Fresh oil. Expensive shoes. Cigarettes that he himself never smoked. These are not amateurs. This is professional, clean work. Their methods suggest that they are as good at covering their tracks as we are at reading them." Sergei, looking at the cigarette butt in his hands, which looked like a piece of gold, suddenly realized the full significance of the discovery. What they had considered a lack of traces was actually perfect camouflage. That was the mystery of the city's traces. They were too clean, too inconspicuous to be accidental. Voron turned toward the street. Now he was interested not in the area around the building, but in the path taken by the portrait car. "We need to follow the tire tracks. They couldn't have gone far in this mud. Where is the industrial zone, where there is a lot of trash and no one is watching?" he asked. Voron felt his old, long-forgotten feeling awakening. This was not just a hunt. It was a personal confrontation. The kidnappers' method, their precision, their cleanliness in covering their tracks, all this painfully resembled the handwriting of those very people who had squeezed him out of the system many years ago. People who considered themselves above the laws of nature and above the laws of human justice. There was only one conclusion, and it burned like a fresh burn. Victor had been tracked down and taken away by trained people. This was no accident. It was the return of the past.
Sergei finally came to his senses. He pointed west. The industrial zone is 3 blocks away. Old factories. There are only warehouses and abandoned workshops there. The perfect place to disappear. Voron nodded.
He didn't wait. He walked over to the Netapir. Shadow immediately took her place, and a minute later, the old SUV, dignifiedly overcoming the mud of the outskirts, drove onto the asphalt, heading for the industrial zone. It was the beginning of a long, exhausting, but necessary journey. A journey of reading the concrete. The smell in the police station was completely foreign to Voron, but at the same time, disgustingly familiar. A mixture of old paper, cheap but strong coffee, ozone from working office equipment, and that specific, weary hopelessness that eats into the walls of any place where people try to systematize chaos. It was the smell of the system itself, a mechanism that Raven once knew well, but had voluntarily renounced. He waited in a small, clean but faceless office, while Shadow, contrary to all the rules, lay at his feet, curled up in a tight, heavy ball. She was not asleep. She was showing her contempt for this alien world, clearly demonstrating that her peace was inviolable. The lead investigator, Artem, entered the office with that exaggerated confidence that Raven always considered a sign not of professionalism, but rather an attempt to imitate it. Artem was probably around 30, wore a pressed suit, and looked like someone who only believed in what could be found in a database or seen on a monitor screen. He nodded to Voron, barely looking at him, and immediately got down to business, as if Voron were just the next item on his daily schedule. He began by summarizing what had already been done, his voice flat and devoid of any emotional coloring, as befits the voice of a machine reciting facts. We checked everything we could, Ivan Andreevich. The family gave their statements. Victor had no enemies, no debts. His phone was turned off at exactly 10:30 p.m. on Tuesday evening. No calls, no messages, no online activity. We questioned the neighbors. Nothing. They saw normal lights and heard normal noises. CCTV cameras at the intersection, 300 meters from the house, recorded heavy traffic, but no suspicious movements. No hint of a struggle or coercion. There was no break-in. The door was locked, and his keys and wallet were still there. No motive. No trace. No coercion. By all accounts, the man simply vanished. We've exhausted our methods while we wait for data from the telecom operators, which, frankly, is unlikely to yield any results. Artem finished, looked up from his tablet, which to Voron was just another layer of lies, and looked at him with undisguised skepticism, expecting the TAIGA detective to start talking about mystical signs or unfaithful birds. Voron did not argue about the protocols. He immediately laid his find on the table, on a snow-white sterile sheet of paper, a neatly unfolded, moisture-soaked cigarette butt, and next to it, a piece of synthetic film. There is a trace, Raven said quietly but firmly, using no names and avoiding personal assessments, preferring to speak in the language of facts. The trace is not on the phone, but on the ground, at the gate of the house, in the mud. This cigarette butt is not Victor's. Expensive tobacco, carelessly discarded. This indicates rank and nervousness. It was smoked by 2 people, as can be seen from the burn and the moisture of the saliva. They waited a long time, at least half an hour, for Victor to come out, or for them to be let in. The shoe prints nearby are thin, expensive leather soles. These are worn by people who walk on clean floors, not on the clay of the outskirts. And most importantly, a thin cut on the honeysuckle bush. A sharp tool, not the work of an amateur. It was taken by trained people in an expensive, heavy car. This can be seen from the tire marks in the oil puddle, which did not have time to dry. Artem picked up the cigarette butt with 2 fingers, as if it were some kind of disgusting artifact, and immediately put it back down with disgust. His face expressed a mixture of cynicism and condescension. Ivan Andreevich, I'm sorry, but this is rubbish. Cigarette butts, tire tracks. According to our data, dozens of cars pass through there every day. This is the outskirts, not a nature reserve. An oil puddle? In an industrial zone? We can't build a case based on a cigarette butt from expensive cigarettes. It's just statistical noise. We're looking for objective data. We have calls, we have cameras. Everything you're saying is intuition. And we need facts that can be presented in court, not in the forest. The conflict that had been brewing for so long finally erupted. It was a clash of 2 philosophies. Artem believed in a system that, being corrupt and blind itself, could not see the truth behind its own protocols. Voron believed in absolute physical truth that cannot be faked. He who covers his tracks must be clean, but purity in the city is a lie. Raven calmly parried. He spoke slowly, deliberately, his words heavy as stones. If it had been a random kidnapper, he would have left dirt. A struggle, a broken door, screams, a smashed phone. His emotions would have given him away. Here, everything is in perfect order. They took him away without leaving a single clue for objective data, because they know that the system only looks for obvious disorder. But I'm not looking for disorder. I'm looking for a violation of logic. Why would professionals who leave no traces smoke expensive cigarettes, smell of expensive perfume, and drive such a recognizable car? To leave a trace for those who know how to read it. It's their signature. They are sure that no one but them will understand what a clean job is. Voron leaned forward, and his gaze, filled with quiet TAIGA determination, made Artem involuntarily recoil. The car, Artem, isn't a tens. Based on the tread and depth, it's either an armored SUV or an expensive minibus with increased weight. Not your neighbor's Toyota. I know your system doesn't want to see this, because such vehicles and such clean methods point to people who are above your cameras and your protocols. To those who pushed me out of this system many years ago, Victor disappeared because, like me, he became a threat to the balance they call order. Artem, despite his self-confidence, felt something he couldn't explain logically. It was the power of conviction bordering on obsession. Despite his departure, Voron's reputation was too strong to simply dismiss his words. Artem, who trusted only clean files, was forced to admit that this cigarette butt, this piece of trash, had now become the most real, most tangible, material evidence. All right, the investigator said with a barely audible groan that sounded more like an admission of defeat than consent. I'll put it in the report. We can look at the cameras within a 2-block radius for the half hour before and after the disappearance, filtering for signs of large vehicles. But I can't promise miracles. It will be like looking for a needle in a haystack. A blind search, yes. Raven nodded. The needle isn't in the haystack, but where it fell. I know where to look. The needle doesn't move, but the vehicle does. I need the route. I'll follow the tire tracks. Your camera analysis will give me the general direction. My tracks will give me the accuracy. He rose, his movement as silent as it was decisive. The shadow, as if on an invisible signal, also rose. And its eyes, full of wild, untamed energy, met the investigators for a moment. It was a silent reproach. You are looking for the truth in the wires, but it lies at your feet, waiting to be picked up. The Raven left the office. The smell of coffee and ozone was instantly replaced by the sharp, frosty air of the street. He knew that the system he had left behind would not help him. It would only get in the way, locked in its own rules. Justice, like truth, does not lie on the surface and cannot be seen through cameras. It is hidden in the dirt, in the trash, in subtle, almost invisible violations of order. And to find it, you have to become part of that dirt again. Now that he had received official, albeit skeptical, permission from the system, he could begin his real hunt. Searching for traces on asphalt is an endeavor almost as hopeless as trying to catch fog with your bare hands. Asphalt, that symbol of indifferent urban order, takes thousands of tire prints every day, but does not keep any of them long enough to be read in the traditional TAIGA sense. However, Voron knew that just because a trace was not visible did not mean it did not exist. It had simply moved into another dimension, becoming not a physical mark, but a logical chain that had to be reconstructed using the smallest clues. His hunt had begun. He slowly drove his old Netapire along the edge of the industrial zone that Sergei had pointed out. Despite the noise of the city, the shadow remained focused and silent, as if immersed in meditation. The SUV seemed to despise this road, its old engine rumbling low but powerfully, breaking through the stream of trucks and rusty cars. The Raven did not look at the buildings, his gaze fixed on the road, and the places where the asphalt gave way to gravel, puddles, or fresh clay brought in from construction sites. Clean work requires a clean road, Raven mused. They didn't go to the center to avoid hundreds of cameras. They didn't go to the residential area to avoid unnecessary witnesses. They went where disorder is the norm, where a heavy vehicle won't attract attention. He found what he was looking for at the intersection of Skladskaya Street and Zavodsky Passage. Here, where two concrete slabs had been broken and murky, viscous water had flowed into the resulting depression, he saw it. A clear, deep tread pattern, which he had already identified at Victor's house. Wide, aggressive grooves characteristic of expensive, powerful tires. The evidence lay where the city eye saw only dirt and destruction. Raven stopped the car and got out. He took his time, allowing his mind to get into the rhythm of the hunt. He knew that this trace could disappear in a few hours when the sun dried up the puddle, but while it was still there, it was tangible. He measured the width of the tread and estimated its depth. The depth was considerable, even in the puddle. This confirmed his initial guess about the heavy weight of the vehicle. He took out a notebook where he made sketches that looked more like drawings than notes. He sketched the tread, noting its distinctive features, small asymmetrical damage that was like fingerprints to him. Following the logic of this trail, Voron moved on. The road led him through a maze of abandoned, dilapidated buildings, past warehouses with broken windows and fences covered with barbed wire. Every 100 meters he stopped to check that he was still on the right trail. On dusty patches, on spots of old congealed motor oil, he found faint but recognizable prints. It was his map. A map drawn with rubber on concrete. Finally, the trail led him to an abandoned parking lot, which, judging by all appearances, had once belonged to a defunct factory. The parking lot was covered with a thin, greasy layer of dust, mixed with metal shavings and fuel oil. The perfect canvas for a trace. Here, Raven saw not one, but several prints of the portrait machine. Apparently it had been standing here for a long time. The tread was clear, almost like a new print. He studied the tracks. The car had been parked here, but it hadn't been turned off. It was ready to go. And then Raven noticed something that changed the picture dramatically. Behind one of the tracks, where the driver had probably gotten out of the car, lay a small fragment of something hard, like thick glass. And next to it was a dark, dented spot that could only be a drop of blood.
Voron didn't touch it. He just photographed the spot with a primitive but reliable camera he carried in his backpack. Blood? That meant Victor had resisted, or he had been wounded.
His gaze, trained to read not only tracks but also intentions, moved to a row of old metal trash cans. They stood at the end of the parking lot and seemed to have been untouched for decades. Under one of the cans, just beyond arm's reach, Raven discovered a crumpled piece of cloth. He carefully pulled it out with a stick. It was a piece of pale blue cotton fabric with a faint, thin stripe, part of a cuff or collar. He recognized the fabric instantly. It was Victor's shirt fabric. Victor was a man of habit, conservative in his dress, and Raven remembered well his favorite, albeit slightly outdated, shirts. The piece of fabric had not simply been torn off. It had been cut off. Cut off carelessly, but with a sharp, cutting object. This suggested two things. First, Victor had indeed been brought here. Second, he had probably tried to leave breadcrumbs, a trace of evidence. Consciously or instinctively, he had left part of his clothing here, so that he could be found. This piece of fabric was a beacon left by a former inspector who knew the rules of the game. The Raven lifted the shadow. The dog, who had been restless until then, now, sensing Victor's familiar, albeit dirty scent, immediately tensed up, his ears pricked up. He ran his nose over the scrap of cloth, then lowered it to pick up the scent from the ground. Shadow began to whimper quietly, not out of fear, but out of awareness of the task at hand. The scent was old, covered in dirt and fuel oil, but it was there. "This is the transfer point," Raven whispered. "They brought him from home in the first car, transferred him here, and from here took him further, to another, even more unrecognizable car. Or, more likely, to the one that was waiting for them here." He looked around the parking lot again, but couldn't find any traces of the other car that had taken Victor away. It seemed that the second car had been parked on a cleaner, paved area that didn't retain any traces. But that didn't matter. The main thing was that Victor was here. He was alive, and he was trying to signal. Voron returned to the Netapir, his face grim and focused. He took out the cell phone he used only to communicate with Sergei and dialed his number. "Did Artem find anything on the cameras?" Voron asked, skipping the polite greetings. "Yes, Ivan Andreevich. A car. A black minibus, no identifying marks, no license plates. It was spotted in this area an hour before Victor disappeared, and then an hour later, it was heading towards the center." "It's not the car you described, but it's massive," Sergei replied excitedly. "This is the second car," Voron cut in. "The first one is expensive and conspicuous. to ensure a quick abduction and escape from the house. The second one is a shadow to blend into the city traffic. They worked according to the classic double transfer scheme. Find me all the video recordings from that minibus. Now we know what we're looking for. Voron hung up the phone. A piece of fabric lay in his hand, soft and helpless. It was a personal marker, a trace marker. Victor gave the signal. Now Raven needed to determine where exactly this second shadow led.
He already knew the portrait of the car. Now he needed the philosophy of cigarette butts. The logic that made them choose this particular route and this particular method. The investigation entered a new, deeper phase. Voron settled in a quiet, inconspicuous motel on the outskirts of the industrial zone, which he chose not for its comfort, but for its inconspicuousness. The shadow, having received a short but well-deserved rest, slept by the door, its presence serving as an invisible but powerful protection from the indifferent world. For Raven, it was time for his own most subtle analysis, reading the trail that nature did not leave, but which man left with relentless honesty. His entire system of knowledge, honed by years of tracking in the taiga, boiled down to one thing. Every object, like every trace, carries within it the story of its creation and its disappearance. In the forest, he read broken branches, trampled grass, and the scent of animals. In the city, he had to read trash. Trash was his new forest, and cigarette butts were his new tracks. On the bedside table, under the pale light of the table lamp, lay 3 pieces of evidence which Voron had arranged in strict order, as if they were ancient artifacts. The first cigarette butt, found near Victor's house. The second, darker and wetter, picked up from the transfer parking lot. And the third, which Sergei had given to Voron along with the minibus data, found 5 blocks from the transfer point at a public transport stop. Voron took the first cigarette butt, the one from the house. It was almost perfect. The filter was not deformed. The burn mark was even, and the ash was dense, almost not crumbling. This indicated that the person smoked slowly, but was under severe nervous tension. He was waiting. He was not distracted. Voron compared it to a piece of packaging film that matched this particular brand. It was expensive, flavored tobacco. The person who smoked it was accustomed to comfort and not accustomed to dirt. His posture was probably straight, his attention focused on his goal, like a predator waiting in ambush, but not accustomed to long, passive waiting. He moved on to the second cigarette butt, the one from the parking lot. Here, the picture changed. The burn was uneven. The filter was tightly clamped between his teeth, as if the smoker was squeezing it, trying to contain his inner excitement. The ash was knocked off carelessly, some of it remaining on its side. The saliva was very wet. All this pointed to a sharp, nervous excitement that was growing. A comparison with the first cigarette butt showed that the smokers were most likely the same, but their condition had changed dramatically. They had brought Victor, but something had gone wrong. The shard of glass and the bloodstain that Voron photographed in the parking lot were proof of that. Victor did not give up silently. He fought back, even though he was immobilized. It was a conflict, and it required a quick solution. Then Raven picked up the third cigarette butt, the freshest one. It was found in the corner of a bus stop, right on the border of the area where, according to Sergei's calculations, the second shadow minibus could have been moving. The cigarette butt had been smoked down to the very core, almost to the fingers. It had been smoked quickly, dry, the filter practically flattened. This cigarette butt
belonged to a person who was not waiting, but, on the contrary, was at the limit of his capabilities, moving quickly, possibly chasing someone, or waiting for someone to quickly pick up or hand over something. The most interesting thing was that it was a completely different tobacco. Cheap, strong cigarettes, a common brand smoked by people who do physical labor. This indicated the appearance of a new player, a local torpedo, someone who was not part of the clean work team, but was hired on an outsourcing basis for dirty logistics. Voron saw before him not 3 cigarette butts, but 3 chapters of a short but intense drama. The first chapter was anticipation and readiness, the tension of the elite. The second chapter was conflict, struggle, broken order, and nervous breakdown. The third chapter was the involvement of the lower ranks, haste, and the need to quickly cover their tracks, dissolving into the faceless flow of the city. He wiped the cigarette butts, carefully packing each one in a separate envelope. The logic of the kidnapping was perfect, as was his analysis. It was not just a criminal scheme. It was a system that operated on the principle of a double bottom. Clean on the outside, rotten on the inside. The very system he had tried to expose many years ago, which, like a snake, had shed its skin but retained its venom. Voron remembered that distant, fateful operation. Back then, in one of the southern districts, he and Victor had gotten close to a high-ranking official who, using his position, was redirecting state funds to dummy accounts through fictitious companies. Victor had all the documents, all the evidence. But the official was more cunning. He did not attack head-on. He used the system to discredit the evidence, and then the inspectors themselves. The Raven was forced out of the structure, slandered, and deprived of the opportunity to work. Victor, who was more gentle and naive, remained, but was quickly transferred to an insignificant position, deprived of any leverage. Now, looking at this trash, Voron recognized the handwriting. Confidence, impunity, the use of expensive tools to start the case, and cheap manpower to finish it. It was the financial and political elite who even committed crimes in accordance with their 49 corporate code. Quickly, cleanly, with minimal personal risk. Voron felt an old, cold rage rising within him. This was personal. Victor's disappearance was not a random settling of scores, but a direct continuation of that unfinished war. The corrupt forces he had fled to the TAIGA to escape had pulled him back into their concrete trap. He himself had, in essence, left his own trail by returning here. The same predator, just in a different skin, whispered Raven. They hide their tracks not in the mud, but in laws, in money, in the anonymity of the crowd. At that moment, a quiet, insistent ringing sounded. It was Sergei. Ivan Andreevich, the cameras worked. That minibus, the shadow... It didn't go to the center. It turned onto the road leading to the old Northport. There's nothing there now, except abandoned warehouses and old river docks. But there's something else. Shortly before his disappearance, Victor tried to gain access to old archives on a port construction scam. From the very era when you left, he was looking for specific documents. Sergei's words hit Voron with force, filling in the missing piece of the puzzle. Injustice. Victor hadn't given up on that case. He hadn't given up. He was seeking redemption and justice, where Voron was seeking only peace. Now Voron understood that it was not only his duty, but also his only chance to finally restore balance. The port, Raven repeated, his voice as hard as old ice. "There are places there that can be hidden even from satellites. Warehouses. We need a map of those warehouses. And I need to know everything about the old port scam. That's the motive. Not chance, but a personal hunt."
They're taking him because he started digging into their past. He stood up. In a city where everything was a lie, garbage was the only honest witness. Now Raven knew. His path lay where concrete met water, where old forgotten secrets were hidden. He wasn't just looking for a friend. He was looking for a resolution to his past. Voron sat in front of an old monitor in Sergei's office, immersed in the dim glow of the screen, which seemed alien and hostile. The office, reeking of official paperwork and unfulfilled hopes, was located in a building that was itself a symbol of the city's system. A jumble of dysfunctional communications, a bureaucratic labyrinth, and the constant, low-frequency hum of unresolved issues. Sergei, his former colleague and only bridge to this world, paced nervously around the room, twirling an empty coffee mug in his hands. Voron, however, needed neither coffee nor fuss. He needed information that, like underground water, was hidden under layers of lies and time. "You have to understand, Ivan Andreevich." Victor was acting strangely. He didn't show it. He worked at his routine job, but for the last 6 months, he was obsessed. Sergei began, finally stopping at the window, behind which the city bustled. He was searching. He was looking for documents, protocols, even old, unsealed accounting reports. I thought it was age-related, a thirst for justice that had awakened in retirement. But he wasn't just looking for the case. He was looking for what broke him back then. What broke us both. Voron nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the screen. Before him was an excerpt from Victor's internal requests over the past few months. The titles flashed by like shadows. Write-off protocol, port, tender request, reconstruction, 2007. List of commission members, object peer number 5. These words, these dry, administrative phrases, carried with them the smell of rust, rot, and stolen billions. It was that very old case about port construction, which 8 years ago had marked the beginning of the end of their careers. Back then, both of them, young and confident in their infallibility, were ready to take down a high-ranking official who controlled the unofficial flow of funds. But the official, as it turned out, was not just a thief. He was part of the structure itself, its nervous system. He did not disappear, but dragged them into a quagmire, where the truth was drowned in red tape and twisted facts. He was looking for confirmation that he wasn't wrong, said Voron, without taking his eyes off the text. We knew the money had been stolen, but we couldn't prove it was him. The system protected him. Victor couldn't live with that, couldn't accept that his honesty was powerless against their cynicism. Sergei returned to the table, his face dark. Exactly. He found it. He found a copy of a protocol that had disappeared at the time. A protocol from a meeting where estimates were approved that were 3 times higher than the actual cost of the work. It was signed not by the official himself, but by his right-hand man, a certain Pavel Gromov.
Victor was sure that Gromov was just a pawn, but Gromov was never punished. He simply moved to another organization. Now, by the way, he is involved in private investments.
He lives in the city and owns a whole network of small security firms and logistics companies, which operate, among other places, in the area of the old North Port.
This information, which sounded like a gunshot, hit the bullseye.
Voron instantly connected the two ends of the broken trail.
The expensive cigarette butt near Victor's house, the expensive car he identified by its tire tread, and Victor's sudden interest in a man who was just a shadow of that very corruption scandal. Gromov,
A man who was too small a fish for their investigation 8 years ago, but who was probably the key to his disappearance now. Did Victor contact him? Voron asked, his voice becoming even quieter, even more dangerous.
He wasn't asking. He was stating the inevitable.
He tried. We found 2 unfinished messages to Gromov in his draft emails. A threat? No. More like an offer. An offer to voluntarily confess and correct the injustice in order to avoid complete exposure. Victor had always been naive in this regard. He believed that people had a conscience, even those who had sold it. Voron felt a sharp, almost physical pain. It was not just the disappearance of a friend. It was a cruel punishment for believing in the impossible. Victor, unlike him, could not escape into the TAIGA and accept defeat. He remained in the city, swallowing its poison, looking for an opportunity to restore the disturbed balance. This obsession with justice, bordering on self-destruction, led him straight into the hands of his old enemies. He challenged them, and they accepted it as they knew how. Quickly, quietly, leaving no trace that the police could read. Voron summed up, finally looking away from the screen. His eyes, accustomed to the long horizons of the forest, struggled to focus on the cramped walls. But you read it. You found a trail that leads straight to the North Port, straight to Gromov's structures. And you found a motive, Sergei said with relief, but immediately stopped himself when he saw the expression on Voron's face. Voron's motivation now needed no explanation. It was personal. Gromov and those behind him were not just criminals. They were the forces that had pushed Voron out of his life, robbed him of his faith in the system, and forced him to flee into the wilderness. They had taken his friend for trying to atone for a shared mistake. Now this city, which he despised so much, had become not just a foreign environment, but the field of an old, unfinished battle. It was a personal challenge, not only to the city, but also to his personal past. The forces that had pushed him out, and were now trying to crush his last ally. The North Port, the warehouses, that's his territory, his lair, whispered Raven. He felt his old hunting instincts, dulled by years of routine, awakening and filling him with cold, calculating power. He needed to go where the cameras couldn't reach, and where the official investigation couldn't get to. He stood up, his movements springy, ready for action. Thank you, Sergei. You did everything you could. I'll go on alone from here. Find me a map of those warehouses, the oldest blueprints you can get your hands on. I need to know all the underground utilities, all the blind spots. I need to see through everything they think is safely hidden. Sergei did not argue, he just nodded. He knew that at that moment he was no longer looking at a tired tracker, but at the very same inspector, Voron, who knew no fear and accepted no defeat. The smell of injustice, like the smell of blood, breathed new life and a new purpose into him. And that purpose was as clear as Gromov's business card, which Sergei had carelessly placed on the table. Retribution. Voron, like a hunted animal, returned to the concrete jungle. But now he was not looking for salvation.
He was looking for prey.
He knew that a hunt in a foreign world awaited him, and that his skills, honed in the TAIGA, might be his only weapon against the lies of the city. The foreign smell in this place was so thick you could cut it with a knife.
It was a bitter chemical, industrial trail, a mixture of machine oil, cold rust, stagnant water, and a subtle, acrid note of unfulfilled hopes inherent in all abandoned urban objects.
Having already covered more than half the distance from Victor's house to the port outskirts, Raven stopped the car on a narrow, broken road, marked on maps as access to warehouses. This was where the relatively civilized, albeit dilapidated, private sector ended, and the territory of industrial desolation, the realm of concrete and metal, began. He released Shadow. In the forest, a hunting dog, a wolfhound with a keen sense of smell, was an invaluable tool. Here, among a million unfamiliar and pungent smells, exhaust fumes, rotting garbage, industrial waste, Shadow's sense of smell was useless for finding a specific person, but it was invaluable as an indicator of strangers. Shadow, like Raven, was a creature of order and harmony, and any violation of that harmony caused a sharp, instinctive reaction in her. Don't look for Victor. Don't look for our scent. Look for alarm, Raven said, quietly, stroking the dog's coarse fur. Shadow, at first stiff and nervous in this chaotic, hostile world where even the sky seemed dirty, slowly began to move. She did not follow a trail as she would in the TAIGA, but moved along an invisible border that she sensed with her entire being. Her head was lowered, her gaze alert. She was not reacting to a specific trail, but to the general field of tension created by the unfamiliar, hostile territory. She avoided puddles filled with oily streaks, ignored the inviting smell of rodents, and focused on one thing: the smell of danger, which, unlike all the others, was not natural to this territory. Their route took them through a maze of old, abandoned warehouses whose windows had been smashed or bricked up. Raven moved slowly, his attention riveted on details. A broken padlock on one gate, graffiti neatly painted over with fresh paint on another, a barely noticeable but fresh tire track on the edge of the road that perfectly matched the portrait of the kidnapper's car. The Raven read the urban environment like a distorted but still understandable manuscript. It is impossible to completely hide a violation of order, even if it is committed on perfect asphalt. The Shadow stopped at a massive concrete building that looked like a former office center or port administration. The building was silent, with no obvious signs of life, but it gave off a scent, not Victor's scent, but a scent that the Shadow considered wrong. She growled, low, warning, but without aggression. It was a warning about boundaries. Raven circled the perimeter of the building. The repulsive smell of the stranger became more concentrated here. It didn't just smell like rust, but like fresh welding, disinfectants, and expensive tobacco. The same special smell that Raven remembered from the first cigarette butt he found at Victor's house. The smell of elite nervousness. The building was the perfect concrete trap. Thick walls, no windows on the first floor, just one massive steel door locked with a complex electronic system. For the average person, this place was completely inaccessible. The police probably didn't even include it in their list of places to check. Too obvious. Too abandoned. It was precisely this obviousness that served as a disguise. In the wild,
A predator hides by blending into the background. In the city, a predator hides by flaunting its uselessness. The raven found what he was looking for. A thin, almost invisible line leading from the wall of the building towards an abandoned drainage channel. It was a discharge line, probably for water or waste from inside. On the dirty, moss-covered concrete, the raven saw tiny, barely noticeable spots. Not blood, not dirt, but something stranger. Crumbs of dry rations or food. Not typical of homeless people or rodents. Nearby was a small scrap of paper, part of a receipt or check, printed on expensive glossy paper. He collected these microscopic pieces of evidence with a thoroughness that city investigators, armed only with cameras and cell phones, would never understand. "They're keeping him inside," Raven whispered. "There are 2 of them, maybe 3. They're nervous because they're feeding him what they eat themselves, and they're not leaving this place because it's their lair." Raven ran his hand along the rough concrete wall. It was the perfect hideout for those who were used to clean work, but had been forced to resort to outright kidnapping. They needed isolation from the system they themselves represented. Isolation that had to seem absolute to them. Shadow, sensing that Raven had read the place, moved away from the wall and lay down at his feet, but remained alert. Her instincts told her that there was an immediate, imminent threat. They both understood that behind these walls, it was not an investigation that awaited them, but a battle. Raven took out a small but powerful pair of binoculars from his backpack, left over from his army days, and began to study the upper floors, where the windows were bricked up. In one of them, on the 3rd floor, just above a freshly painted strip, he saw something that even the most attentive would have missed. Thin, barely discernible crack in the brick-filled opening, which could serve as ventilation or, more importantly, a vantage point. This crack, no more than 2 or 3 centimeters thick, was the only window in their lair. Voron's thoughts raced at lightning speed. He couldn't enter through the front door. The electronic lock was most likely connected to an alarm system. He needed to be discreet. City dwellers always look up or straight ahead. They don't look at their feet or up at the sky. And they never pay attention to communications, which they consider dead. The Raven remembered an old map of the area that he had seen at Sergei's place. According to the drawings, an old sewer collector ran under this building, decommissioned more than 10 years ago, but not filled in. The collector, which, coincidentally, began a few blocks away in the industrial zone and led straight under the port building. The TAIGA teaches one thing. If you can't go over the top, look for a way underneath, Voron whispered, glancing back at Sergei. Sergei was still sitting in the car, nervously rubbing his hands. He was his connection to this world, his insurance. But from here on, he would have to go alone, descending into the underground waters of the city, where his darkest shadows dwelled. He patted Shadow on the head. "Let's go, my friend. It's time to look for the old maps. We need an underground trail that they thought didn't exist." And at that moment, as Raven turned toward the old drainage canal, he felt the concrete haze of the city become something more tangible, more alive. It was a hunt for predators who had forgotten that there are not only human laws in the world, but also the laws of nature, which always lead to the restoration of the disturbed order. Raven stepped into the shadow of the collector. Descending into the old collector was like plunging into the belly of a concrete beast sleeping beneath the hum of the city. The Raven found access in an abandoned drainage canal, which was marked as inactive on Sergei's maps. But judging by the smell of stagnant moisture, it was not completely sealed.
He moved in the semi-darkness, lighting his way with a dim, focused beam from his flashlight, which did not give off scattered light that could reveal his presence in the narrow crevices of the above-ground world. The shadow, despite its obvious aversion to dampness and the metallic taste of the air, walked alongside, pressing close to its master's leg. Its instincts, though confused by the unfamiliar environment, telling it that here, below, they were closer to the source of the threat than above, amid the hustle and bustle. There were no random passers-by here, no cameras, only the dead order of old communications, forgotten by everyone, except those who hid in them. The Raven's skills, honed over years in the TAIGA, easily adapted to this underground, man-made wilderness. He read the moisture on the walls, determining where there were weak spots in the masonry and where fresh air was seeping in, indicating potential mines or basements. He avoided the central trough, filled with viscous, thick sludge, and moved along the edge, where the concrete steps for servicing the collector remained relatively dry, trying not to leave a single trace on them that could attract attention. In the forest, a tracker must be invisible. His footsteps, inaudible. In the city, underground, this rule was multiplied tenfold. For here, any sound, any reflection of light, any vibration was carried along the walls, becoming a loud announcement of an intrusion. The Raven's movements became slow and fluid, using the shadow of every pipe, every bend, every concrete column as natural cover, as if hiding behind the trunks of centuries-old cedars. He did not penetrate the wall. He became part of it. After half an hour of invisible movement, which seemed to last an eternity, he sensed a change in the smell. The rot and rust were mixed with a dry, warm, electric aroma. The smell of human presence, but not of dirty everyday life, but of clean, professional tension. On Sergei's map, this place coincided with the deepest point of the building, where, according to the drawings, there should have been an old, unused storage basement with a single ventilation outlet. Voron lifted the shadow in his arms so that she would not make a sound, and carefully approached the cast-iron hatch. Contrary to expectations, the hatch was not welded shut, but locked from the inside with a simple but powerful bolt. This meant that it was not an emergency entrance, but a working entrance that was used regularly. It took Raven only a few minutes to break in. He used an old TAIGA technique based on leverage and a precise calculation of metal stress. Without making a sound or causing any damage, he managed to break the bolt, which could not withstand the concentrated pressure at a single point. And the hatch gave way. Voron climbed into a narrow, low room, which turned out to be a vestibule between the collector and the main basement. There, in the semi-darkness, among welding equipment and empty canisters, he began to read the traces already inside the lair. The first thing that caught his eye was not dirt, but order. Everything was clean, swept, and the tools were in their places. This confirmed his earlier conclusions. The kidnappers were neat, professional people, not used to working in film. They had brought their sterile, lifeless order here. But absolute order is always a lie, always an attempt to hide the chaos that lies beneath the surface. Raven focused on the violations of this order. In the corner, under a tarp, he found what he was looking for. It was evidence. First, there were the remains of food. An untouched, almost new package of expensive coffee. Several empty cans of energy drinks, which, as Voron knew, were used for stimulation during long hours of waiting, and the wrapper from an expensive chocolate bar. This was not the food of homeless people, not Victor's food, but the food of his jailers. This meant that they lived here, but they did not rest. They were in a state of constant combat readiness, fueling themselves with artificial stimulants. Voron realized that there were only two of them. This was indicated by the presence of 2 used coffee cups and 2 sets of bedding rolled up into tight rolls. They took turns on duty, trusting no outsiders and never leaving their prisoner. The second, much more important piece of evidence was the papers. Among the crumpled napkins and scraps of plastic wrap, Raven found several pieces of paper, obviously torn from a folder. They were covered in Victor's handwriting. They were excerpts from old reports, tables of financial flows dated 2007. On one scrap, the name Gromov, P.A., was underlined, and next to it, in Victor's neat handwriting, was written, "The key to Pier number 5. The papers were not a cry for help. They were a mark left behind. Victor, realizing that he was being taken away, tried to leave something in his house that would reveal his motive and the name of his executioner. He didn't have much time. But as an old inspector, he knew that information was the only thing that could not be completely destroyed. He knew that Raven, or someone with his mindset, would find these fragments and piece together the picture. The Raven gathered the papers. He realized that Victor was here, and he had been here for at least 2 days, judging by the number of rations used and the layer of dust that had settled on the tools. He was being held, not for murder, but for questioning. They needed to force Victor to hand over the original of that very key protocol, or find out who else he had managed to pass the information on to. Voron moved further along the narrow corridor. He found a place where a chair or armchair had recently stood, judging by the characteristic dents in the old linoleum, and next to it, a thin line, as if something had been dragged. Not heavy. A human body. It was a passageway. Victor had been here, in this basement, but judging by the direction of the drag marks, he had been moved to another room, more isolated, more secure. Perhaps because they had learned of increased interest in the area. One of the torpedoes that Raven had learned about from the cigarette butts might have said something or attracted attention. At the end of the corridor, Voron came up against a metal door with a combination lock. Unlike the hatch, this lock was new, expensive, and would take time to overcome. But right above the lock, he saw a barely noticeable, very thin trace of rust. A drip. The rust was old, but on top of it was a thin strip of fresh oil, barely visible under a layer of dust. This meant that the lock had recently been lubricated and opened, but not with a code. It had been opened with a key, or something that required physical contact and subsequent lubrication of the mechanism. They come and go, Raven realized. If they came, there had to be someone who ensured their safety outside, who performed logistical tasks, who distracted attention. That same torpedo with cheap cigarettes. Voron, not wasting time on the lock, returned to the vestibule. He took his binoculars and, carefully lifting the hatch just enough to slip them through the crack, looked up at the abandoned office on the 3rd floor, through the very same thin crack in the boarded-up window that he had noticed from outside. The crack gave him a window into the lair. There, on the 3rd floor, in an empty, discolored office, he saw not Victor, but one of his jailers.
A young, strong man sat at a desk, lined with electronic monitors, like a watchman in a tower.
He was holding a phone in his hand, and his lips were moving in nervous silence. At that moment, Raven realized that they weren't just hiding Victor. They were waiting for someone. They were preparing to move or make a deal. And the person they needed was someone who wasn't part of their clean team. The Raven closed the hatch. The information had been gathered. Now, he didn't need to hunt the predator, but rather the liaison, the one with the cheap scent.
He had to find the one who smoked cheap cigarettes, the one who brought them food, the one who was their only unreliable bridge to the outside world.
It was the dirtiest, most unpredictable trail, but it was the only one that could lead Raven straight to Victor. He returned to the cold concrete corridor, feeling the adrenaline give way to cold, calculated determination. The cold, sticky rain that had suddenly fallen on the city had nothing in common with the cleansing downpours of the TAIGA. Here it was simply a continuation of the dirt and grayness that permeated the concrete. Raven sat in an old, disused trailer, hidden among the undergrowth and piles of construction debris, in the heart of the industrial zone, in a place that seemed to have been created specifically to be forgotten. His prey, Vitaly, the one who smoked cheap cigarettes and whose tracks spoke of nervousness and low skill, was cornered without a sound, without a single shot. The Raven tracked him down by his delivery routes, by the barely noticeable crumbs of food and cigarette butts that led from his lair to an old, inconspicuous cafe where Vitaly apparently received orders and relaxed. The hunter removed his target from its familiar, safe environment as silently as a lynx takes a hare from the trail.
Vitaly, nicknamed Lom in close circles for his slowness and low mental capacity, was more of a consumable than part of the clean team. Now he sat on an upturned bucket, his face earthy gray, his damp hair stuck to his forehead.
He had not been beaten. He had not even been wounded. His fear was purely psychological. The Raven, sitting opposite him, did not raise his voice or threaten him with a weapon. He just watched.
Raven's eyes, accustomed to endless expanses, seemed deep and penetrating in the dim light of the car. They read Vitaly not as a person, but as an unreliable element in a complex system. It was the gaze of a predator who knows exactly where the fine line between life and death lies, and which side of that line his prey is on right now. You smoke cheap tobacco.
Your rations are expensive, Voron began in a quiet, even voice that contained neither condemnation nor pity. Only a statement of fact. You waited outside Victor's house for 2 hours. In the cold. You brought them food. You watched the perimeter, and now you're not afraid of me. You're afraid of them. Vitaly flinched. He was used to shouting, to beatings, to interrogation by the book, but not to such a cold, precise analysis of his miserable existence. Who are you? You're not one of us. Not a cop, he muttered, his voice hoarse. I'm not part of the system, Voron confirmed, without changing his posture. I came to restore balance. Victor, you saw him. He's old. He's not dangerous. Why are you holding him? I don't know. I just brought him food and water. I'm on the outside. Lom tried to justify himself, his eyes darting around the walls, looking for a way to retreat. But there was no way out. Raven blocked the only exit. You're part of the trail,
Raven continued. He spoke slowly, enveloping his victim in facts like a spider envelops its prey in a web. You're the weak link in their clean operation. They used you because you're cheap and don't ask questions.
They left you behind. You're already dead to them, Vitaly. You know it. If I leave, they'll find you and clean you out, because your noise in their perfect silence. The Raven spoke of the logic of predation, of the laws that govern both the forest and the city. Any superfluous element must be eliminated. This simple, cruel truth sounded more convincing than any threat. At that moment, Vitaly realized that the man in front of him could see right through the world, see his destiny. It wasn't police pressure. It was the pressure of fate. They moved him. Just now. The words flowed from Loma in a sudden, dirty stream. His resistance collapsed like an old dam. They didn't want Victor himself. They wanted the papers. Victor burned them while they were sleeping. He said he hid copies. They tortured him, but he's silent. The customer was supposed to come today to pick him up and take him away for good. Forever. Voron leaned forward, and even in the dim light, Vitaly saw a gleam in his eyes that came not from the lantern, but from concentration. Where? Name the place. Lom nodded feverishly, trying to shake off the fear that gripped his insides. He gave the address. An old Soviet bunker under the former Museum of Urban Development in the very center of the city. An absolutely incredible place, as far away from the industrial zone as possible. The most inaccessible, most reliable place you could find. They used the outskirts as bait, as a first clue to confuse the police, but kept their target in the heart of the concrete trap, right under the nose of the entire system. And this place, this museum, was a symbol of the very large corruption scandal that once affected Victor and forced Voron out. The customer. What's his name? Voron's voice became even quieter, but took on a steely tone. Vitaly swallowed. They call him Petrovich, but it's Gromov. Pyotr Alexandrovich Gromov. The one who... Voron didn't let him finish. He knew. Pyotr Alexandrovich Gromov, the man whose name was inextricably linked to Pier Number 5, to those very billions that had vanished into thin air, and to the injustice that he and Victor had been unable to prove many years ago. The man who was too high up to be reached, the man because of whom Raven had gone into the TAIGA, having lost the battle with the system that protected its own. The personal became obvious. It wasn't just a debt to a friend. It was a personal challenge to the past that had caught up with him in the heart of a strange city. It was an opportunity for redemption, not only for Victor, but for himself. Raven felt that almost forgotten icy rage awakening inside him, the kind that turns a tracker into a hunter. He moved away from Vitaly. Lom, exhausted, continued to sit. Voron took out Sergei's phone. I found the place, the Museum of Urban Development. The basement. An old bunker. Gromov. Come over. Lom will stay with you. Sergei, accustomed to orders, asked no unnecessary questions. He simply said one word. I'll be there. Voron left the shed, leaving Vitaly in the semi-darkness with his own fear. He felt neither satisfaction from the interrogation nor hatred for this petty executor. Lom was just part of the landscape, part of the rotting urban garbage. Now Voron had to face the master of this trash, the man who considered himself above the laws of nature and the laws of conscience. The road to the city center, to Gromov's bunker, was a road into the very heart of his personal history. Justice demanded not just punishment, it demanded the restoration of the disturbed balance.
Voron moved toward his shadows, into the very heart of the concrete trap. An instant awareness of danger struck Ivan's temples with an invisible but palpable wave, more powerful than any city siren.
The name thrown out by Torpedo sounded not like a key to the mystery, but like a bell, announcing that the hunt was over. And now the Raven himself had become the prey.
Semyonov, a man Ivan knew and had tried to take down many years ago, was not just a corrupt official. He was a master of behind-the-scenes games, a systemic predator whose power was based on invisible connections deeply rooted in the foundations of this city.
If Semyonov, now a high-ranking official, knew about Torpedo's involvement, and he certainly did since he had hired him, then he had already calculated all of Ivan's possible moves. The moment Ivan entered the game was the moment Semyonov prepared the cage. Every trace that Voron so carefully read was not simply left behind, but skillfully planted. An expensive cigarette butt, a clear tire tread, even a scrap of Victor's fabric. All of this could have been bait leading to a precisely calculated trap. Semyonov couldn't have known about Voron's secret methods, about his ability to read subtle clues. But he knew exactly how his former colleague, who had once worked in the system before leaving it for good, thought.
Semyonov understood perfectly well that Ivan, having found a thread, would pull it straight to his goal, like a predator to its prey, and that it was on this path that they would be waiting for him.
Voron stopped his old car in a narrow, dark alley between tall, deaf walls of warehouses. It was a labyrinth of concrete, metal, and garbage, where the light of the street lamps fought against the pitch darkness, only emphasizing its aggressive presence. At this level, the city ceased to be just a dwelling place for people, turning into a complex, multi-level defensive structure, a stone beast, sleeping with its eyes open.
Ivan, sitting behind the wheel, slowly inhaled and exhaled, trying to synchronize his internal rhythm with the disharmony of the city.
He needed not only to get to the specified address, hidden in the heart of the central industrial zone, but also to pass through a hostile space, which, as he now understood, was entangled in invisible threads of surveillance. The navigator showed the shortest route, a straight road through several large intersections, perfectly visible to municipal cameras, and, much more dangerously, private security systems. Anyone walking along this path became an open book to those who held all the keys to the city. Raven couldn't afford that. The road is a trap for those who rely on speed and directness.
At that moment, Ivan remembered the words of his old teacher in the TAIGA. A beast driven into a corner always looks not for a way out, but for the least expected path to salvation. He got out of the car, opened the back door, and let Shadow out. The dog, sensing his owner's tension and the hostile, unnatural mixture of smells, immediately pressed himself to the ground, his coal-black eyes scanning the darkness intently. Raven crouched down beside him and stroked his powerful neck.
"We won't look for him on the ground, friend. The ground here lies," whispered Ivan. And it was not just an address to the dog, but an affirmation of his method. A city dweller builds defenses based on what is at eye level and on the road, but he forgets about verticality.
and depth. He does not consider the roof to be a forest, nor the sewer system to be underground burrows.
For Semyonov and his mercenaries, Ivan was supposed to appear from around the corner, as a bandit should, or at the very least, drive up in a car. They did not expect him to become a shadow, gliding between the dimensions of concrete. From that moment on, his journey through the urban taiga began. First came the basements. Voron found a weak spot in the back room of an old store. An iron door that was not locked tight, but only hastily covered.
Inside there was a familiar, unpleasant but understandable smell of decay, mold, moisture, and dust. It was the perfect hiding place. Moving in a half-crouch, Raven glided along the walls, using skills honed over years to avoid touching a single wire, a single forgotten box, a single lever. The shadow moved behind him without a sound, its paws stepping on the concrete with the softness of a cat's grace, made even more acute by the tension of the city. The basements gave way to utility tunnels that smelled of dampness and heavy oil. It was a world the city tried to ignore, a world of pipes, cables, underground rivers, a world where no gaze from the street could penetrate. Here, Raven felt almost as confident as in a fir forest. Only, instead of the smell of pine needles and moss, he was accompanied by the smell of rust and chemicals. He knew that there were no cameras down here, no accidental witnesses, only silence, broken only by the hum of transformers, like the distant growl of an unknown beast. Then there was the transition upstairs. Raven climbed out of the basement through an abandoned elevator shaft in an old, empty administrative building. He climbed the internal fire escape, which creaked under his feet, like an old pine tree under the weight of snow. But the sound dissolved into the constant noise of the city. The roof was his new, temporary thicket, a horizontal plain covered with tar moss and dried grasses that had broken through the cracks. Here, at the height of the 10th floor, Raven could see. He could see the geometry of the streets, the location of hidden corner cameras, the patrol lines that were unaware of his presence above their heads. He moved from roof to roof, jumping across narrow technological bridges and ventilation shafts, using the shadows of advertising structures and satellite dishes as cover. Each roof, each platform was his staging point, a temporary camp from which he could adjust his route without leaving a single trace that could be seen from below. He understood that Semyonov, this man's system, planned to meet him on the asphalt, in a world ruled by cars and cameras, but not in this cold vertical world where only birds look. The shadow followed him with surprising devotion. Its urban uselessness turned into an unexpected advantage. It moved as if it did not exist, silently, like a cat, not distracted by smells that meant nothing to it. It was pure instinct, a beacon that kept Ivan within the boundaries of reality. After an hour and a half of moving like this, bypassing several kilometers of ground route, Voron found himself on the roof of a low, squat building, just 50 meters from the place he called Torpedo. It was an old, sturdy factory building, surrounded by a high fence topped with barbed wire. Voron crouched behind the parapet, studying his target. 4 powerful searchlights flooded the perimeter with bright light. But the workshop itself remained dark, its loopholes either bricked up or tightly closed. A classic urban fortress, impregnable from the outside, but like any human construction, it had a weak link. Raven felt his pulse slow, his body filled with an animalistic, cold clarity. In the taiga forest, If you see a trail, you don't rush. You assess the wind, the time, and the trap. Here, above the concrete, it was the same. Only instead of the wind, there was the noise of the city. And instead of traps, there were cameras and Semyonov's people.
Ivan knew they were waiting for him, but they couldn't predict where he would come from. Surprise was his only weapon in this alien world. He took a few small tools out of his backpack, a set of lockpicks, a thin wire adapted to bypass the simplest signaling systems, and most importantly, his old, heavy hunting machete, which seemed ridiculous in the city, but gave him confidence.
Even looked at the shadow, who was pressed against him, not taking her eyes off the workshop, and whispered quietly, "Now the descent, down where the past hides." The hidden bunker the torpedo had mentioned turned out to be not a basement in the usual sense, but part of an old, walled-up system of bomb shelters, located under the central pumping station. It was the safest, most alien place in the city. Thick, reinforced concrete walls, behind which all the noise of the city bustle trembled and subsided. A complete absence of windows. Airtightness that turned the interior into a separate, artificially controlled world. Such places preserved not only lives, but also the dirtiest, most closely guarded secrets. Voron reached the perimeter and knelt down on the rough roofing felt of the roof. The searchlights he knew about illuminated the courtyard, but, as Raven expected, they created perfect zones of bright light and deep, impenetrable shadows. It was the shadows, not the light, that were his allies. Semyonov or his people had not bothered to create uniform lighting. They had simply put up a barrier, thinking it would stop him. Ivan carefully studied the structure. The factory workshop, which appeared to be a monolith, was actually connected to an annex, which, judging by all appearances, was used for temporary accommodation of security personnel. It was there, in the wall of the annex, that there was a ventilation grill, old enough that its fastenings would give way with enough force. This passage was too narrow for a person, but Raven needed something else. He pulled Shadow behind him, who waited for the command with an impatient, low growl, barely audible over the roar of the pumps. Shadow, like its master, sensed the proximity of the target and the hostile energy emanating from the place. "Your exit, friend," Raven whispered. He took a small but powerful crowbar out of his backpack. 3 strong, calculated movements, and the old rusty grate came away from the concrete with a quiet creak. Ivan patted Shadow on the head and pointed to the opening, quietly but insistently ordering, "Wait." The dog, realizing that he was not going into battle, but on a covert surveillance mission, slipped into the darkness, leaving behind only a faint trace of the scent of the taiga, quickly absorbed by the musty air of the city. Shadow's task was simple: to become their eyes and ears inside, to warn them of any movement. While Shadow worked, Raven moved to the entrance. 2 guards, dressed in identical black uniforms, without identification marks, stood guard at the massive steel doors of the bunker. They were young, confident, and, most importantly, bored. Their weapons hung loosely. Their attention was scattered. They were expecting an attack from the road, not from the roof or from inside. Ivan, using the shadow of a drain pipe, climbed down from the roof onto the canopy adjacent to the workshop. From there, it was only 2 meters to the ground. He landed on his toes without making a sound. The street skills he had acquired before the taiga returned with the same sharpness with which memories of youth return. He walked along the wall, pressing his whole body against it, dissolving into the texture of the brick. The first guard, engrossed in a conversation on an old push-button phone, was neutralized in a fraction of a second. Ivan crept up behind him, giving him no chance to react. His left hand, quick and strong as a trap, covered the man's mouth, preventing him from making a sound. His right hand, with a precise, practiced movement, grabbed the weapon, then delivered a sharp, painful but not fatal blow to the nerve center of the neck. The body, deprived of will, slowly sank into Voron's arms.
There was no rage in his actions, only the cold, mechanical efficiency of a predator, removing an obstacle on the way to its prey. He quickly dragged the body into the shadows between the generator and the wall. Raven left the weapon, a pistol with a silencer, untouched. He didn't need a firearm. He wasn't going to fight by the city's rules. All he needed was silence and time. The second guard raised his head. He sensed that something had changed. His instincts, dulled by routine, sounded the alarm. He put down his cigarette butt, as expensive as the one Ivan had found on the outskirts, and slowly reached for his radio.
This was the move Raven had been waiting for. He lunged forward with a speed that no one who saw his old worn jacket and tired face would have expected. The guard only managed to shout part of the word code or alarm, but the sound was cut off when Raven crashed into him, using his body weight and momentum for a crushing but controlled throw. They crashed onto the concrete. Raven ended up on top, his hand finding the pain point on the collarbone. He pressed with such force and precision that the man's scream turned into a rattle, his eyes filling with horror and disbelief. The guard was young and strong, but he had never encountered such pure, primal rage wrapped in icy calm. "Where is he?" Raven asked, his voice low, like a stone falling into a well. There was no answer, only an attempt to resist. Raven pressed harder. Pain pierced the guard's brain. "Third level, Semyonov's private basement. Down the hall, code is 666, but he may change it." Ivan loosened his grip. The man gasped for air, desperately trying to breathe. Without saying another word, Raven tied him up with a strong synthetic rope, which he always used to entangle his prey in the forest, and gagged him with a piece of old cloth. Everything he did was designed to keep his victim alive, but completely incapacitated. Now the entrance was clear. Behind the massive steel door, which the guards opened with a card, was an airtight vestibule airlock system. Raven entered the code 666. The numbers lit up green, and the door hissed and clanked open, releasing a wave of cold, musty air. He stepped inside, feeling the unfamiliar, airtight space envelop him. This was the entrance to the lair. There were no cameras in the corridor, only motion sensors installed high up and responding to heat. Raven covered himself and the shadow, which had appeared from the ventilation system, with a thick foil camouflage cloak that he always carried with him. The shadow, though it did not understand the meaning of these manipulations, unquestioningly followed his movements, pressing itself against his legs. They became one. A shadow in the shadows, invisible to the electronic eyes of the city. Inside the bunker, it smelled of money, old papers, and fear. The Raven descended a narrow spiral staircase that led deep down to the third, lowest level. Its every step echoed in his mind. He knew that he was not just going to meet an official, but a man who embodied all the filth and injustice from which he had once fled into the forest. It was personal. It was redemption not only for his debt to Victor,
but also for his own past. At the last landing, the corridor narrowed, and at the end of it, he could see a single door lit by a dim eye-light bulb. That was the goal. Raven took off his camouflage cloak. Now that he was so close, he no longer needed to hide. He was ready for battle, ready to destroy the enemy's order. The shadow tensed, preparing to pounce. There was a faint creak behind him. Raven froze. He realized he had missed something. The trap hadn't worked outside, but it had worked inside. Someone was on the second level, behind him. The Raven did not turn around. He looked only ahead, at the door behind which Victor was hiding. He knew that if he stopped now, he would lose. He had to act. The door in front of him, or the enemy behind him. The choice was obvious. Duty was more important than self-preservation. Ignoring the faint creak behind him, Raven rushed toward the door. A simple, TAIGA-like logic flashed through his mind. The main prize is in front of you, and it is more important than a random obstacle. He rammed his shoulder into the steel surface, but the door was obviously reinforced and held. Then he took 2 steps back, ordered Shadow, "Wait," and kicked the door, aiming precisely at the lock. It was not a rough push, but a precise, concentrated impulse designed to destroy the internal mechanics. The heavy metal responded with a dull groan, and the door, torn from its hinges at the top, slid inward with a crash. Behind it was a small room, more like an interrogation room or a cell, where the air was thick with fear and dust. In the center of the room, tied to a steel chair with thick synthetic restraints, sat Victor. His face was haggard, his skin pale and covered with a layer of sweat, but his eyes, cloudy and tired, still retained a spark of recognition. When he saw Ivan, his gaze flashed with shock at first, then disbelief, and then, like an extinguished fire, a faint but warm flame of hope flared up. It was mixed with a quiet reproach that Ivan had come, but had come nonetheless. Next to Victor, behind a simple, heavy metal table, sat a man whom Voron knew all too well. Leonid Semyonov. He was dressed in an expensive, perfectly tailored dark blue suit, which seemed completely out of place in this dungeon, but perfectly reflected his nature. A man who brought external, polished power to the dirtiest corners of the city. Semyonov did not flinch at the sound of the door being torn off its hinges, nor did he even turn his head toward Ivan. He slowly placed a gold pocket watch inlaid with mother-of-pearl on the table and looked at it as if measuring the time remaining until the end of the world, or, more accurately, until the end of his own performance. Behind him, in the shadows, stood another man, his right hand, a stocky, short-haired man with empty, indifferent eyes that reflected only a willingness to carry out orders. He was a functionary, not participating in the drama, but merely ensuring its conclusion. "You've always been too impatient, Raven," Semyonov said, his voice quiet and even, like the whisper of money, and not raised a jot, which was a sign of absolute control. He finally looked up. There was no fear or surprise in his eyes, only deep, cynical disappointment that his game had been interrupted. "I told you that the system doesn't like surprises, and the city doesn't tolerate romantics. I left enough clues for you to come, but not for you to burst in." He waved his hand toward the wall, where a large monitor hung, showing a static image from a camera on the stairs. The recording had been paused.
Ivan realized that Semyonov had seen him approaching.
I expected you to be drawn in by the small stuff. Cigarette butts, tires, as always. And you came. Loyalty to an old friend. Or perhaps an unquenchable thirst for justice, which once ruined you. Your TAIGA romanticism is useless here, Ivan. Here, downstairs, it's just dust on my expensive parquet floor.
Voron took a step forward, covering half the distance between them. His hand reached for his machete for a moment, but he stopped.
He knew that the fight would start as soon as he made a sudden movement. His goal was victor, not unnecessary bloodshed. You drove Victor here because he knew, Raven began, his voice rough and low, like the grinding of stone. He knew how you robbed the city 10 years ago, how you destroyed the investigator who stood in your way. He was looking for justice. You're not here to do business, Semyonov. You're here to hide your sins, to bury them deeper, under layers of concrete, which you love so much. Hearing this, Victor flinched, and his cloudy face contorted with pain. Semyonov laughed, but there was no joy in that laugh, only cold weariness from superiority and endless, boring struggle. Justice. That's a word from textbooks, Ivan. The kind written by dreamers like you and your friend. Here, down here, under the concrete, it means nothing. Here, he gestured around the cramped room as if it were a throne room. The rules of the game are the ones I set. Money is true justice. It balances the world. It creates and destroys. Power is the highest law. Victor was looking for documents. He wanted me to pay according to the law. But the law is what people like me write, and I rewrite it every Tuesday afternoon, changing commas and paragraphs to suit my needs. Semyonov took a glossy, thick packet of documents from the table, the very one Voron had been looking for based on the scraps of evidence. This is what he was looking for. All the evidence. And now what? He's dead. You're the last person who saw him alive. And you're going to die here too. And no one will remember your justice or his documents. The city will simply forget about both of you. Ivan felt the familiar, bitter taste of powerlessness that he had felt on the very day he was kicked out of the system, when all his evidence crumbled to dust because of one phone call. The city, this concrete trap, always won, because its rules were steeped in lies. It did not allow for natural balance. It swallowed the truth and spat out lies. But now Voron was different. He had learned to see not only traces, but also the essence.
He knew that all of Semyonov's showmanship, the expensive watch, the suit, the stack of documents, was just a facade masking his inner, corroding fear. "You talk about the rules of the game," Raven said slowly, pausing after each word. "But you broke the main rule. You created an anomaly. You tore a man from his life, disrupted the balance that holds the world together. In the TAIGA, if you disrupt the balance, retribution comes. Nature itself cleans up the traces, and you are just a trace that will soon be erased." Semyonov raised his hand, his right hand stepping forward, finally fulfilling its function. "Enough philosophy, Raven. You've gone too far. It's time to end this sentimental fairy tale."
Raven waited. He did not look at Semyonov's right hand. He looked into his eyes, penetrating the mask of arrogance to the small, trembling soul inside. It was this psychological pressure that proved unexpected. As the right hand moved to grab, The shadow, like a black ghost, silently jumped out from under the table where she had been hiding when she entered the room with Ivan. She made no sound, but her sudden appearance frightened the function man more than the shot. The dog, obeying an unspoken command, did not attack, but took up a position between Semyonov and Victor, its low, guttural growl filling the room with a primal, inexplicable terror. Semyonov's right hand froze, stunned by the appearance of a wild beast in the heart of the bunker. This was not part of the plan. And at that very moment, when all attention was focused on the shadow and the trembling guard, Raven lunged forward, but not at Semyonov. He reached Victor in a single leap and, using the machete not as a weapon, but as a tool, cut through the synthetic bonds with one precise movement. He pulled his exhausted friend out of the chair and threw him into a corner, away from the fight. Only then did Ivan turn to the customer, who was still sitting at the table, frozen in place. Semyonov, seeing his captive freed, finally lost his cynical mask. Pure animal fear appeared on his face. He tried to grab the bag of documents from the table, but Voron was faster. He intercepted the movement, sharply struck the official on the wrist, causing the bag to fall out, and kicked it against the wall next to Victor. At that moment, Raven struck Semyonov in the face, not to kill him, but to break his will, to deprive him of his false superiority. A broken nose and blood on his expensive collar marked the beginning of the end of his power. Semyonov, unaccustomed to physical contact, began to panic. He tried to push Ivan away, using his body weight. But Raven, who had spent the last 10 years fighting nature, was stronger. He grabbed Semyonov by the collar and threw him to the floor like a sack of potatoes. The official whimpered, trying to crawl away. Semyonov's right hand finally snapped out of its stupor and reached for his holster. But Voron was ready. He grabbed the machete, which he held like an extension of his arm, and, without aiming at the man, plunged it into the concrete floor between the guard's legs with a deafening screech. The guard froze. The sound of the machete piercing the concrete was louder than any gunshot. The threat was not death, but inevitable, precise violence that would leave no chance. Voron looked at him, and there was no human in his eyes. There was a hungry, patient predator who had been waiting for this moment. The guard lowered his hand. He realized that the system he served no longer worked here. Ivan pinned Semyonov to the floor with his foot. The official was choking on blood and tears. The Raven leaned over him and said, "You talked about the rules of the game. Now the game is over. You are removed from the system. You will wait here. Your power remains up there, on the asphalt. Here, down below. You are just a man who has upset the balance, and you will pay for it. Not according to the law that you rewrite, but according to the old natural code." He used the same strong rope to tie Semyonov and his right-hand man. Victor watched the whole scene from the corner, clutching a bag of documents in his hands. Finally, order had been restored, albeit by foreign, unsystematic methods. Voron did not kill. He simply prepared the field for harvest, leaving irrefutable, obvious evidence for the system he despised, but had to give a chance to cleanse itself. Finally, the Raven looked up at Victor. In the heavy silence between them, saturated with the smell of blood and metal. No words, explanations, or feverish embraces were needed. Victor's eyes, still full of pain, exhaustion, and an unfamiliar bitter triumph, spoke of gratitude and awareness of the price that had been paid. "You did it," Victor whispered,
his voice dry and weak, like a dried-up spring. You brought back our past. You finished what we couldn't do back then.
Raven nodded, his own face a mask of fatigue that hid a deep, devastating satisfaction. He didn't consider it a victory in the usual urban sense.
He considered it merely the repayment of an old debt, the restoration of a balance that had been disrupted many years ago, when they had both, each in their own way, lost to the same all-consuming system.
Voron took a step back, giving Victor time to catch his breath, curl up in the corner, clutching the folder with documents, which was now not just papers, but his second life. Ivan stood, surveying the battlefield.
Semyonov, bound and blooded, lay like a deflated balloon, his expensive suit crumpled, his gold watch ticking uselessly on the floor. All his pretended power remained in the world of concrete. And here, below, he was just a hunted, pathetic beast.
Raven took the machete, carefully wiped it on a piece of thick cloth left on the table, and fastened it to his belt. It was a ritual of cleaning up the trail, preparing to leave. It was necessary not only to win, but also to leave behind a flawless message that the city machine, no matter how cynical it was, could not ignore. He walked over to the monitor, took a flash drive out of his inside pocket, a small inconspicuous item that Sergei had given him some time ago, and with a quick professional movement plugged it into a hidden port. He copied a still frame from the camera to record the exact time and place, then downloaded the recording of the last 2 hours. It showed Victor's capture, then the entire scene of Semyonov's conversation about the rules of the game, and finally, their own sudden, predatory intrusion. Voron knew that digital traces in the city were as important as footprints in wet mud in the taiga. They cannot lie if read correctly. This flash drive was his last, cleanest trace. He put it away like a precious stone in his pocket, where it lay next to a crumpled cigarette butt. Now it was time for the riskiest step. Direct dialogue with the system he had left. He took out the satellite phone he used only in extreme critical cases and dialed a short, long-known number. A beep. On the other end, a dry official voice answered, one that Raven recognized immediately. The head of the investigative department, a major general, the very same man who had once personally signed the order for his dismissal, without hesitation. "Speak," the general said without greeting him. Voron skipped the formalities, not wasting time on games. "You have an urgent message, General." His voice was firm and low, absolutely confident. "Send a task force to this address, the bunker under the old Communications Administration building, on Revolutionia Street, number 12. Urgent." He gave the exact, verified address, which he had figured out himself, without relying on city maps. "What's there?" "Who is it?" The general's voice became wary, with an intonation uncharacteristic of his high rank. A mixture of distrust and professional intuition. Voron looked at the bound, bloodied Semyonov, then at Victor. "There's a major corruption scandal there, General. A living witness, and the man who hid him. I'll leave all the evidence on the table. The person you were looking for is Leonid Semenov, the deputy mayor for economic affairs. He's tied up and alive." There was a long, ringing pause. The general, a man of the old school, could not ignore such information. The weight of Semyonov's name, spoken in such a tone, was too great. "Who is speaking?" he demanded, this time with a harsh, uncompromising intonation.
An old lead, and it's clean. Don't look for me. Look for the truth.
The flash drive with the recording is there, next to Victor's documents.
Voron hung up the phone, took the battery out, and threw it into a dark, damp corner of the room. No return calls. No way to track him down. Now it was time to act.
He checked on Victor, lifted him up, and helped him lean against the cold wall. Victor was weak, but his will was not broken. "Go," he squeezed out. "They'll find you. They'll be here in 10 minutes, no later."
Semyonov can't afford to be caught like this. Voron nodded. He knew the price of his appearance. But he couldn't just leave. He returned the bag of documents to Victor, tightly sealed and undamaged. "Here," he said. "This is your prize. Your truth.
Your chance. The redemption you've been dreaming of."
Victor clutched the folder with trembling hands, pressing it to his chest like a shield. "Thank you.
I don't know how to pay you." "Don't say that," Raven cut him off, his gaze as straight and cold as mountain stream water. "I did what I had to do. The debt is paid. Justice is not the law. It is balance. Now it's your turn to restore it. But according to their rules." He took a step back. The shadow, like a loyal vassal, sat motionless, his yellow eyes seeming to see not only the walls of the bunker, but also the distant, familiar forest. Around them, in the bunker, a noise began to rise slowly. A sign that the city machine had started working and was beginning to respond to the blow. The first shadow appeared on the stairs, leading from the basement. It was the major in charge of the case, the same one who had talked about cameras and telephones. He wasn't waiting for reinforcements. His professional curiosity, and perhaps a barely smoldering fire of honor, drove him forward. The major saw the bound figures, Semyonov, bloodied but alive, and Ivan standing like a hunter over his prey. His face was a mixture of shock, indignation, and involuntary professional envy. "Raven, I knew you weren't here for no reason. You've made a complete mess here. What is this place? Why Semyonov?" The major looked at Ivan, not believing his own eyes. Ivan remained silent, allowing the major to see the bound figures and the exhausted but alive Victor with a folder in his hands.
"The trail is clear, Major,"
Raven finally said, pointing to the table and the flash drive. Victor's documents, the flash drive with the confessions and the video. The two are tied up. The victim is alive. I brought you everything on a silver platter. Your case is no longer a lost trail, but corruption. He looked at the major, expecting skepticism, but saw in the investigator's eyes a glimmer of something like old, forgotten honor that had survived under a layer of cynicism. The major nodded, his jaw tensing. "I know who Semyonov is, and I know what these documents are. You've meddled in something that's none of your business again, Voron, and you've done it with dirty tricks again." "It concerns me," Raven retorted. "He's my friend, and it was my duty. Law or no law, balance must be restored. You lost your battle for justice 10 years ago. I've just finished it. Your system can take credit for this victory. It loves other people's achievements." He turned to leave, but the major stopped him. "Listen, they'll be looking for you. Do you understand who you're up against? They don't forgive those who break their rules, even when you're right." Raven smiled, but there was no joy in that smile.
A city dweller fears being seen. I'm going where I can't be found, where my name is just a bird.
There are no rules in the TAIGA, but there is a code. He didn't wait for an answer, beckoned to Shadow, and moved toward the emergency exit, the one he had found by following the smell of dampness and shadows.
Victor tried to stand up, his lips whispering something indistinct. Raven turned around one last time. Victor, holding the folder to his chest, looked both broken and renewed. He was on the threshold of a new, long, and difficult struggle. But now he had evidence, his weapon. They exchanged long glances. There was more than a farewell in them. There was an understanding that both of them, albeit in different ways, had paid the price for the past and had been given a chance at redemption. Raven felt no joy, only a quiet, devastating purity. The mission was over. He disappeared into the darkness of the emergency stairwell before the first police sirens tore through the night air, heralding a victory in which he did not want to participate. Morning came. Morning in the city is not the birth of light, but the slow, painful manifestation of smog, concrete, and countless humming machines. It began not with birdsong, but with a rumble that rolled in waves, promising bustle and meaningless movement. The Raven stood on the outskirts, where the cracked and dirty asphalt finally gave way to a dirt road leading deep into the forest. The old, well-traveled car, which seemed like a foreign object among the shiny city SUVs, was already warmed up. Nearby, crouching down, Shadow waited. She too felt the approach of freedom, her tense body, which had been on alert all night, now relaxed, preparing to leap onto her native soil. Ivan looked at the city, which was shrouded in a thin, grey haze, through which the first faint rays of the sun were breaking through, unable to warm or clear it. The city did not look defeated. It just looked like an anomaly, a place where natural laws had been perverted and replaced by lies and greed. He remembered Victor, his exhausted but enlightened face, clutching a bag of documents in his hands. Victor stayed there, below, to fight the system by its own urban rules. It was his path to redemption, his personal tribute to justice. And Raven? Raven had paid his tribute. He had restored balance, but not for the city, but for himself and his friend. He had brought chaos here to create order, and now he was leaving to let the system deal with the consequences of his intervention. "Let's go, Shadow," Raven said quietly, and the order needed no repetition. The dog jumped silently into the back seat. Ivan got behind the wheel. He didn't look back. There was no need to look back at a place that evoked nothing but disgust. The engine purred, and the old car slowly pulled away, leaving behind endless, faceless high-rises, garbage cans, and dirty asphalt roads, where he had learned to read the traces, not of beasts, but of human vice. He had to translate his TAIGA skills into a foreign language, the language of cigarette butts, tires, rust, and the shadows of surveillance cameras. But the principle remained the same. The trail left by any living creature always tells a story. In the city, that story was just dirtier and more encrypted. The further they drove away, the more he felt the tension ebbing away, the cold, steely grip of the city loosening its hold. With every kilometer, the air became cleaner, the smells clearer, and even the sunlight seemed more honest. The sky above their heads ceased to be just a dirty ceiling and began to turn blue, promising infinity. In the TAIGA, there were no high-ranking officials,
multi-million-dollar scandals, or gold watches. But there was truth, solid and unchanging like stone. And there was a code. Survival through respect for balance. It was this code, not the police charter, that helped Voron find and return his friend. Voron felt devastated, not because he was physically tired, but because he had briefly touched the rot and hypocrisy he had been running from for so long.
It was like emerging from icy water, relief mixed with pain from the sudden change in temperature. Redemption came not in the form of a joyful triumph, but in the form of quiet, bitter sadness.
Justice had prevailed, but it always came at a price. And in this city, that price was incredibly high. He had restored order, but he knew that this order was temporary. Corruption was not a single villain, but an integral part of the city system itself, like mold that inevitably appears on anything that stands still for too long. He had no doubt that his actions would provoke a response. Semenov, even bound, still had connections and influence. The major, even if he was a man of honor, was only a small cog in a huge, slow-moving machine. But Voron was no longer part of it. He left them a clean trail, flawless evidence, and an opportunity. Whether they used it or not was up to them, the city, their fate. His duty was done. At one point, as they drove past a dense forest that for the first time in many hours seemed alive rather than just a backdrop, Raven stopped the car. He stepped out onto the road to take a deep breath. Shadow jumped out after him, ran around a few times, eagerly sniffing the familiar smells of pine needles and rotten earth, and returned, nudging Ivan's arm with her wet nose. There was more understanding in this gesture than in all the conversations he had heard over the past few days. She did not condemn him or demand explanations. She simply waited for their shared trail to lead them back to their native wild land. The Raven leaned on the hood and closed his eyes. He saw not the faces of Semyonov or the Major, but only the green, thick darkness of the taiga, his true home, his refuge. He realized that the city had not broken him because it had not been able to make him renounce his code. He remained true to balance, even when working in a world of imbalance. His skills, his obsession with truth, all of this only made sense there, in the forest. He would not wait for news, would not follow the trial. His justice had been served in the basement, amid concrete and lies. What came next was no longer his story. He returned to the car, his movements becoming more measured, more calm. He was back in his own skin, in his natural environment, even if he had not yet left the road. He started the engine, and the car slowly crept forward, leaving behind not a trail to hide, but a path to continue. He was driving home, to where his methods and his code had real, genuine meaning. The city was an anomaly that had spewed him out again, but had failed to swallow him whole. Order, his personal, internal order, had been restored, and that was enough for the quiet, weary soul of the hunter.